Good morning. Awesome to see all of you here. I love being the first presentation in the morning. Everyone's still kind of groggy and maybe hungover, maybe not. Just one public service announcement. We're at 5,200 and some odd feet, and you can drink half as much and get twice as drunk. So if you didn't figure that out last night, again, that's the public service announcement for this morning. Great. Well, I'm excited today. I'm Alex Cooper. I run business development and sales for TabitPay, but don't worry, this is going to be a very technical presentation, I promise you. And, we're here to talk about push payments. And just the mere fact that I'm saying push payments is, I think, a very interesting and exciting concept and phenomenon in the industry, right? And we'll tell you more about push payments, pull payments, and you're not going to hear us use all the same terms that you might be used to if you've been in the payments industry. You're going to hear a lot of new buzzwords and terms. So in today's session, whoops, if I can use this. In a little while, you'll also get introduced virtually. We couldn't get our whole team here today, to Erin, Andrea, who's head of product, Sarah Robinson, engineering, and we're going to take you through a fairly technical deep dive into push payments, into our APIs, expose you to our sandbox, and give you lots of different learnings, right? But before we do that, I want to make sure what I've learned in all my years in fintech is that, if we're not all starting from the same plane, it's kind of difficult, right? So again, some of this, you might be experts, you might know more than me, I hope you know more than me, but we want to start and give you an overview of push payments, talk about different payment flows, including pull payments, tell you just a little bit about TabitPay and what we do, but really stick to giving you first a high-level concept of the payment industry as it relates to push and pull payments, talk about some of the business considerations for those that need to know that, discuss the funds flows of payments, and then we'll get right into actually building an app and getting into our sandbox. Okay. So first thing is, to make this work, we got to use technology. So there's a Zoom meeting that you all should connect into now if you have a computer with you and on. Please get on the Wi-Fi. That's the information for the Zoom meeting. And that will allow you to converse with us. We're going to do some Q&A. We're going to do some polls. We're also going to expose you and give you the credentials to get into our sandbox. So for those that can and want, please connect into that Zoom meeting link. Okay. While you're doing that, I'll let Jason pop up our first poll question. Jason, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Our first poll question. Hi, I'm Jason, head of marketing for TabitPay, is about Rails. So I'm going to launch a poll, and as you get in, we'll give you about a minute or so. Alice can vamp around, but we'll give you about a minute to ask what rail do you primarily use. We have the options of ACH, card, debit, and credit, as well as RTP. So I'm looking forward to the poll results, and I'll go ahead and display them when it comes up. Looks like we've got one for debit credit already. Thank you for whoever logged in.
Yeah, so for those who are joining late or just getting into the room, we just started the presentation. We've also put up credentials. Actually, Jason, the credentials are being hidden by the poll pop-up. I don't know if you can remove the poll pop-up.
Okay, I have mine. So yeah, the meeting ID is 865-2777-6591. And the passcode is 8675309.
Here, while people are doing that, give me back the screen and I'll put the PowerPoint slide with the information on as well. Or do I have to take it back? Let's see.
Yeah, you can take it back.
All right, the poll question, let's get rid of that. Okay.
Good.
Again, there's
we have
the
9
Zoom
results
information.
in. So we've got 13 people participating, 5 people have done there. Got a question for no option for wire. I'll add that next time.
Okay. Great. Let me get rid of this here. Okay.
All right. I'll go ahead and end the poll right now and share the results. So the results were 5 voted for ACH, 3 voted for card, debit, and credit, and no votes for RTP.
Okay, awesome. All right, thanks, Jason. So what is TabitPay? TabitPay is an instant money movement platform, right? We have 3 main use cases. If I can just stop, maybe I'll put my mouse down so it stops moving on me. Persnickety mouse, right? So we do 3 things at a high level, and this will start to get you oriented towards the use cases for instant money movement, both push and pull, right? We help fund accounts some of the largest neobanks and neo-wallets and neo-brokers in the country, such as Chime and Stash, and we make it easy for anyone to take funds from one bank account and move them into a wallet or another bank account or a brokerage account or crypto account, right? So that's one of our use cases. We also do disbursements, right? So we do disbursements for the top 4 or 5 early wage access programs in the country, like Erin and Dave. We do disbursements for remittance companies, both P2P, US domestic disbursements. We can do cross-border disbursements through some of the push-to-card rails that are provided by Visa and MasterCard. And we also collect payments, right? So it's really, I think, hard or not advisable to talk about push payments without also discussing pull payments, right? Again, it depends on your use case, but if you're dispersing a loan or dispersing early wage access funds to someone, you need to collect them back, right? So our platform is a single unified API designed to give you many different ways to pull funds from businesses and from people, from consumers, and to also disperse funds. Okay, just a little bit about TabitPay. I used to say that we're the world's best or the country's best kept secret. I don't think we're such a secret any longer. We're already a top 10 processor according to Nielsen. We focus, again, on instant money movement. So we are an acquiring processor. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But what differentiates us from other acquiring processors, the ones you're probably all familiar with, is that we only focus on money movement, or what I like to call fintech use cases, really what you are doing in this room today. So we're currently already processing over 20 billion in volume. We process over 250 million transactions. I think we did 1 million transactions in a day the other day. So, and what makes us really good at what we're doing is a couple of interesting things, right? One is that we work with 15 banks and growing today. Why is that important? Again, we'll talk more about acquiring and why that matters, but in order for you to move money, you need a bank to sponsor you. Whether you have money transmission or licenses to acquire funds through the card networks, you need a bank sponsor. So we work with 15 different banks so that we can support all the different types of fintech use cases that you need in a very highly regulated and high-risk space, right? And we also have the ability to acquire funds in the US and Canada and disperse funds around the world. So that's a little bit about TabitPay. Okay, so again, I apologize in advance. This is Payments 101 or Payments for Idiot. I'm a former idiot. Ask my wife, maybe I'm still an idiot. But we are in the merchant acquiring business, and that's kind of strange. You know, I talk to fintechs every day, and again, some of them have payments backgrounds, some do not. But the first thing you have to understand is that if you're going to acquire payments, and this relates mainly to the card rails, to using Visa and MasterCard and American Express, that like it or not, you as a fintech, assuming most in the room are fintechs, are now a merchant, right? You're not selling goods and services, you're not brick and mortar, you're not e-commerce, okay? But you are still taking funds from a customer, you are pulling those funds if you're in the pull model, acquiring funds, you have risk of chargebacks, you have risk of fraud, you have PCI concerns, you have other compliance concerns, and you are actually being boarded as a merchant. And that's one of the things that TabitPay will help you with, right? And then behind you being a merchant, as I mentioned before, you need to have an acquiring bank to sponsor that activity. Again, TabitPay works with 15 banks. We actually help our clients and do all the due diligence and underwriting and help them find the right banking partner, right? And then when you acquire those funds from your customers or your businesses, that's where TabitPay comes in and actually, or another, you can substitute Stripe, you can substitute WorldPay, you can substitute First Data, Fiserv, FIS. They all are acquiring processors, right? And we are able to acquire transactions through either a terminal or through the internet, through our APIs and through our iframe and other technology, and send that through the card brand networks, right? And eventually immediately that transaction will get authorized or rejected by the network based on its relationship with the issuing bank. Is this card real? Does it have funds available if it's a debit card? And we will authorize that transaction. And then again, working through the banks, we will also settle those funds, get the funds from the issuer, get it into the sponsor, the acquiring bank, and then eventually get you the funds. It's all very complicated, but again, if you're going to pull or push funds, you are part of this flow as the merchant, and you're going to need to account for all those capabilities that I've just outlined for you. So let's get into the use cases for instant funds movement, right? And these are the primary use cases that we're serving today. There are more, and next poll question will ask you about some of the use cases that you're serving. So I mentioned challenger banks or neobanks, right? And they typically are going to come to us and have two use cases. They want to fund accounts, right? Most of these banks today started out by relying on ACH funding. ACH works, it's inexpensive, but it could take 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days between holidays and banking cycles. You have a lot of exposure because the funds may not be there. You may get NSF. You're typically having to use third-party APIs like Plaid or other capabilities provided by Moov. But it's certainly a workable model. But again, the debit rails and the things that TabitPay does for pulling funds makes it easier to get funds in and also dispersing funds, right? So these neobanks, first of all, the push model isn't just dispersing funds back to my other account. I want to take money out, put it in Chase. I want to send a friend of mine money. I want to send money to someone else. It's also used to actually fund their account. So there's sometimes when you want to take funds and load it into a neobank, it's not just a push, it's also a pull. And we'll show you some of those flows, right? So for lenders, we typically do instant fund disbursement. You want to get the loan funded. We can do it through various rails, including the debit rails, including ACH, including RTP. We can also collect funds back, low-cost collections, right? Again, you're in the money movement business. You're not in brick-and-mortar e-commerce. And the reason I keep saying that is if you go to a traditional merchant acquire, they're going to want to charge you basis points, 100 basis points, 200 basis points. Well, you know, that's your entire revenue stream if you're a neobank, right? You need that issuing revenue. So, you know, optimizing for costs is extremely important in money movement as well as risk too, right? I mentioned we do early wage access, very, very similar to lending. It's a lot more focused on, you know, people need money. It's usually a small dollar amount. I need it today at 3 o'clock. How can I get my funding directly? And then how do I collect the money back? We're doing a lot in B2B payments. One of our customers is Melio, and a lot of people have heard about Melio. A lot of people call us because they want to be like Melio. But there's a lot of new use cases coming up in the ability to take vendors or suppliers that don't normally accept electronic payments in different industries and enable them to accept payments from customers in various modalities. So that could be also a pull, how to get the money from the customer, and then how to send it to the biller or supplier in a B2B model. We handle some of the largest remittance companies like Remitly. And one of the things interesting about the financial model when it comes to remittances, again, if you want to pay for remittance online with Remitly or TransferWise, you're going to probably be asked for a debit card because ACH is going to take too long. It's not good funds. And that debit transaction is a merchant acquiring transaction. It's pulling funds out of your account, but it's using a different transaction structure than a typical e-commerce merchant. As I mentioned before, we do crypto as well. Same thing as a neobank. We're going to be able to fund the account, disperse funds, and if there's collections, we can also do that as well. So those are some of the basic use cases. Hopefully that makes sense, and some of you can relate to that in your own business models. Okay, take it away, Jason. Hello, Jason.
Right, of course I'm stuck on mute, but everyone's familiar with how that goes. So we have a new poll question here. What is the primary money movement use case? What is your primary money movement use case? Is it B2B, banking, crypto, earned wage access, lending, marketplaces, NFTs, which are pretty popular these days, remittance, solution provider, or other? Solution provider would be more like B2B, banking as a service, fraud, other associated services, and so on like that. Hopefully we captured everything here, and we're not going to get a bunch of others, but it's really interesting to see things come in. We have about half of the group have already participated, which is wonderful. We'll keep it up for about another 20 seconds or so, and really appreciate the engagement. This will help Sarah and Erin help kind of craft, their section of the presentation as it comes up. All right, we're starting to slow down a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here and hand back to Alex. We'll share the results to everybody. And it looks like kind of spread about, but a bunch of B2Bs. So we got 4 B2Bs, 2 bankings, 2 marketplaces, 1 remittance, 2 solution providers, and 1 other. So I'll hand it back over to Alex.
Thank you. Okay, so that's kind of interesting, and we'll talk more about B2B because that's really interesting. A lot of you are focused on that, right? So as I said before, I don't feel you can talk about push without pull, right? Some use cases and models is strictly push funding, right? I'm a lender. I have money that someone's borrowing, right? So I just need to disperse funds. But then on the backside, I'm going to need to collect it back, right? Again, as I mentioned before, with bill pay and neobanks, there's always going to be where you're getting the money from. That's usually going to be an acquiring pull transaction, and where is the funding going, disbursements, right? So although we're here today to focus on card, I think probably all of you are taking a look at, well, what are the different options and rails open to me? Maybe I'm doing ACH today. Maybe I've heard about RTP, which is the clearinghouse consortium of banks that's offering also real-time funding directly to bank accounts through your bank and routing number, as opposed to having to provide a debit card. So there are multiple options. And I think in order to have a disbursement solution or a pull solution, you need to take into account what's going to get it there the fastest, the cheapest, or the most appropriate manner for that use case. And how do I reach all my customers, right? Some customers are comfortable giving you, or consumers or businesses, they'll give you a bank account number. Big business is not going to give you a debit card. So maybe that means the RTP rails are more appropriate. So it's important to understand all the options, and understand potentially how you can waterfall down, right? How you can work with a platform like Moov or like TabaPay and figure out what's the right use case and what's the right payment option for that use case, right? A couple of buzzwords. So if you're pulling funds from an account, that's typically called an account funding transaction. You can do that through the Visa network, through the MasterCard network, and you can also do that through the regional debit networks. TabaPay is actually connected to all the debit networks, and we do that because we can provide what's called least cost routing. We can optimize and give you low cost. Remember, you're moving money. You don't want to pay, hundreds of basis points to move money. You want the least cost way and the least risk way to do that. So the card brands are very good at doing that, and there's lots of techniques that you can use. RTP is also available, but RTP is really today a push-only model, right? They've developed what's called a request-to-payment model. It's not widely available. Only certain banks have it. So there's a lot of considerations with RTP. It's only 65% of all bank accounts today that you can disperse to. So that's certainly the tipping point. It's a great capability versus ACH. The funds get there immediately, 7 by 24. You get acknowledgement immediately. It's a good funds model. So there's a lot of benefit to RTP, but it's not enough of a solution yet today, I think, in almost all use cases, right? And on the push side, if you're pushing funds through the card rails, that's typically called an OCT transaction, right? The funds have to be in the account, in the sponsor bank account that you're pushing from. It's a good funds model. The funds settle instantly. There's very low risk because you're pushing good funds, and the costs are typically much lower. So, but in our opinion, for a push, OCT and the card rails is going to be a fantastic option because it is low cost. It's more than ACH, but it's still very low cost, and it's ubiquitous. You can reach 100% of all customers if they're willing to give you a debit card and if you're connected to all the different card rails. Okay. So there's a lot more to it in terms of the timing of when you have to have the money in the account, the timing of when you receive money if you're pulling. So there's lots of nuances on the business side, on the funds flow, on the compliance and regulation. But this gives you hopefully a little bit of an overview of the two basic types of transaction types and the push and the pull through various rails. So here's an example that we didn't create it. I think we took it from, give Visa props. We took it from the Visa website. They have an interactive demo. But again, it gives you the idea of how you're going to take your UI, UX, capture information from that customer. Okay, if you're opening an account, where's the money coming from? Is it coming from my Wells account, my Chase account? How much money do I want to fund? And whether you're building your UI, UX through a mobile app or through a website, what you want, just like in e-commerce, you want a seamless experience. You don't want them to have to go to a third-party site and get credentials on their bank account if you can help it. You don't want to have lots of different brands and logos. You want to be able to provide a very seamless type of experience, right? Which means, again, if you're looking at processors or gateways, things that TabitPay does, we can support these types of UI, UXs and keep you out of PCI scope. That's another important consideration. Again, you're now a merchant acquiring. You have to deal with PCI regulations and risk as well as anything else. So you want to look for a platform that can provide you APIs, iframes, integration, RSA integration, so that you don't actually see this card information. The customer is putting it in, but it's being tokenized and encrypted, and the processor is dealing with that. So all those are issues that you have to think about if you're going to build a push or pull solution. Okay. And the same thing on the funding side, just the reverse, right? You probably already know where the customer's money is, you have it, and now you're asking them for where do you want to send funds and how much to send. Again, this can get very sophisticated. You can send funds to their own account to account, me to me. You can send funds to person, someone else, kind of like a Venmo or Zelle. You can send funds to a business. You can send funds cross-border. The other issues, and we'll talk more about other considerations if you're doing this type of P2P movement, is again, depending on the use case, you're going to have to think about money transfer licenses. You're going to have to think about KYC, AML, a lot of other considerations depending on each use case. And that's something that a company like TabitPay will help you to sort out and make sure that you have your ducks in order, because the banks are going to require you to do that too. So some use cases are very light. I just participated in a clinical trial and I got a $50, instead of a $50 check, I got it onto a push to my account. There's very little consideration. There's some consideration still for KYC, but they're very light. Other examples, particularly P2P and remittances, there's a lot more that you have to do. You're basically getting into the money transfer business, whether you have MTLs or not. So all these are considerations to think of in addition to just how much does it cost and what technology do I need to implement. All right, so again, this is the last two slides. I really want to at least not scare you, but educate you on some of the business considerations, because what we find, we have fintechs and developers, they want to get in their sandbox in 5 days, 2 days, 20 days, they're ready to go. It's like, great, we're integrated, let's go. And again, not so fast. We have to get you underwritten by a bank. We have to make sure you're not touching the money. We have to make sure that we can help you optimize and not have chargeback risk. And we can do that very successfully through lots of different tools and technology so that you can minimize or eliminate risk. And so these are the things that you need to think about in addition to the actual technology integration. How do you optimize for authorization rates, right? If 5 or 10% of your transactions are failing, that's not a great customer experience, right? Why are they failing? Did your processor code it right? Did you send it through the right network? Are you doing all the appropriate things? Have you checked for other processing characteristics as well? Compliance, I keep talking about compliance. Again, if you're a fintech, you already live in this world one way or the other, right? And when it comes to money movement, there are no shortcuts, and there are mistakes that are sometimes unrecoverable. So it's important you pay attention to all of these things. And then the final one, and again, it's something that people take for granted, but you shouldn't, is, I call that ubiquity and reliability, right? So ubiquity, as I mentioned before, is that, RTP only hits 65% of the accounts. That's not going to make people happy if they can't send their money. And even with push to card, unless you're using all the rails, MasterCard, Visa, regional debit rails, there may be outlier cards from a small issuer, a credit union somewhere in, I won't mention a city or name, but somewhere that you haven't gotten to. So that sours people. As well as reliability, right? Believe it or not, the networks do go down. So if you have the ability, as TabitPay does, not just to access Visa, but to access MasterCard, to put things through multiple rails, even if one network is down, we can switch transactions and still give you 100% reliability and coverage. So those are all some of the additional considerations besides the technology that I wanted to bring out to you today. Okay. And then finally, again, and Moov is a great example of this. If you look at their platform and their open APIs, right? You don't just need to do a push or a pull. You need to have KYC. You need to have OFAC check. You need to do, in the case of cards, we support different risk tools such as address verification, 3DS. We also support taking cards, tokenizing them out of Apple Pay and Google. These are all things that you need to consider in addition to actual pulling and pushing of money. Why? To reduce fraud, to reduce risk, and to optimize your authorization rates, right? And my recommendation on the compliance side is hire somebody that's done this before, right? This is not something to be taken lightly. Bring in outside people for advice, but hire someone to manage your payment operations. Even in a disbursement model that's low risk, there are still risks and issues, and particularly if you're starting to pull money as an acquiring merchant, hire someone that's done it before. Okay? Awesome. So I finished my portion, so I get to be quiet unless there's any specific questions that you have before we get into the technical side. All right. So we'll put up another poll question, and then we'll give our team a little time to, go ahead, Jason, take over.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question about push or pull. So how do you move money? Multiple choice, of course. Pulls, which would be ACTs, account fundings, or pushes, more OCTs, disbursements. Again, this will help the coding examples and that sort of stuff. Alex, could you do me a favor and stick the last slide on there so people that want to participate in the Zoom meeting can log in if they haven't already?
Okay.
Again, that meeting ID, just for reminders there, is 865-2777-6591.
Hey, Jason, that number sounds very familiar. Where'd you get that number from?
Well, the passcode is a familiar number, right? So it's my the passcode is my Kroger card number. So it's 867-5309. All right, we'll end the poll since we're at a minute. And I'm going to share results with everybody. Interesting. So we got 7 out of 10 pulls and 9 out of 10 pushes. But it looks like a lot more pushes than pulls.
Great.
So thank you all for your participation. And let's kick it over to Erin and Sarah.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Alex. Thanks, everybody, for joining our workshop today. I'm Erin Andrea. I'm the head of product at TabitPay, and here with me today is Sarah Robinson, our lead engineer. And we're going to be moving the conversation to the next level of detail, beginning with a 5-minute overview of API best practices for instant payments, using TabitPay's developer pages to provide you with a visual sense of how a processor's API structure supports merchant product offerings. And then we'll briefly walk through a detailed example of what a basic pull followed by a push transaction request looks like. And after that, we'll take a few minutes to get everyone set up in Postman so that we can walk through some of TabitPay's sandbox test cases. And once we get you started, you'll have time to add on to the basic setup and try different scenarios after the walkthrough. And then at the end, we're going to open up the floor to talk about your use cases. How do instant payments come into play for your business model? What features do you want to add for pull push payments to serve your customers? And do you have questions about how to design those use cases? So I'd invite you to type questions in the Zoom chat at any point. Our limitation is I don't think we can hear you, but we can see your chats, or you can play telephone with Alex to get the questions to us, or unmute yourself in Zoom, and then we can take the question that way. And then I'll pause in a couple of spots so we can check to see if there are questions as well. So I'm going to share my screen and also add the link here in Zoom to our developers page, which is just developers, if I can spell it, .tabapay.com. Okay, so everyone should be able to see our developers page at this point. And so TabAPay offers a unified RESTful web API service with multiple resources, and each with a set of standard HTTP methods. We use the JSON format for transmitting data. So our API fields are mapped to the corresponding data elements of each card network. And then we send the transaction details to the card networks for further processing, ultimately landing with the issuer for approval. So the fundamental operation for payments is creating transactions. So you would post a request for creating a transaction inclusive of critical data such as the payment sender's basic information, card network identifiers, account details, source of funds for a push payment. For example, is the push payment sourced from a debit, prepaid, or credit card, bank account, or even cash or check? And then the two major pull push types are the bank account and card. And although real-time payments using a bank account is trending upward in demand, the card, primarily the debit card, is still the most popular and ubiquitous solution available. So the details can vary based on setup. Perhaps, for example, you're using a processor's iframe for card entry to avoid PCI scope, which is a popular choice with our clients. And they can vary by use case, bank or card, or by country, currency, OFAC values if you're doing sanction screening, and the level of security you want to require. So card security code, for example, is optional on a processor level, but you may want to require it for your customers. And as a general rule of thumb, the more detail included, the better chances of preventing fraud while still maintaining high adoption and approval rates, because there are many low friction and frictionless security checks like AVS, card security code, and enabling customers to use Google Pay and Apple Pay. So supporting resources for this main API functionality can include things like querying cards. And you would use this to learn if a card is enabled for push or pull, identifying the type of card, whether it's credit, debit, or prepaid, see if it's associated with a regulated bank, which would give you insights in terms of interchange costs. You can run an AVS check and obtain associated standard fees for the bank, the network, and the processor, but note that these can vary per transaction. And with TabAPay, you can also ensure that the card isn't a duplicate. For example, if a merchant's end user opens 10 accounts with you and attempts to use a single stolen card to load funds in all 10 accounts, which that user then quickly withdraws. Duplicate card checking is a great security feature for preventing this issue. And then another supporting feature would be watchlist queries. Let's say your customers are sending funds to recipients in other countries. It's important for these highly regulated funds transfer requests to include sanction screening and ensure the participants are not on applicable watch lists like OFAC. And then finally, you can store accounts with your processor, or if you are a processor, offer this feature. This is a great feature for offloading the risks and associated heavily regulated PCI procedures tied to processing with card data in the clear. So a merchant or ISO would obtain, or platform would obtain account IDs for each bank or card record, and then use those account IDs to create transactions for processing. And a processor like TabAPay would then translate the account IDs to the sensitive account information and handle the network processing work on behalf of our clients. So I'm in a table talking about 3DS in detail. Just know that there are multiple ways to support 3DS for both card in the clear and stored account transactions. And the latest EMV 3DS format has greatly reduced the friction that made it difficult for 3DS 1.0 to gain traction in the US. So the level of protection that 3DS offers for push payments is still being researched. This is an emerging use case, but it's one that we'd be happy to discuss and explore with you in the future if you have further questions. So I'm going to pause here to see if anyone has questions before diving into an example of a successful push-pull.
In chat, or if you have a, is my mic on now? Do you have a hand mic?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you. I can't see the chat, oddly. Maybe if I stop sharing. Oh, there we go.
Okay, so if you,
Nope, okay, we're good.
you can use chat, but if you have a we have one question here in the audience. Here you go.
I was just curious. I saw that to create a transaction, I noticed that you have to first create an account. But for example, if I'm doing an ACH transaction, I'm sending from source to destination. Do you have to validate these accounts beforehand? Or how do you go about validating these accounts? I know do you just verify with Plaid and then just use the account?
I mean, you can verify, that would be one way to do it. You can also use this query API in order to check, to validate the card and determine what the attributes are, see if it's a duplicate card, what the features and types are. And to clarify, you don't have to set up accounts with your processor, or at least you don't have to with TabaPay. It's an option that a lot of our clients choose because they don't want to deal with card numbers in the clear. But you could, as you can see from the transaction create, go back to this one, that you are able to both process with account IDs, in addition to, sorry, my computer's a little slow, in addition to being able to process with the card information itself.
Also, one of the benefits if you do push the card is you don't need to use an external provider like Plaid to verify accounts, right? You can get the card information, you can get the name and address, match it up to what you have on file, so it could be a more effective tool. Any other questions? Okay, go ahead, Erin.
Yeah, let's pull that open a little bit. Okay. All right, so I'm going to switch to another document real fast to show you a detailed use case example.
We're not seeing your screen. Hold on, I got it. I think you have to show your screen again.
Yeah, it just takes a second. Okay, so in this scenario, this is a case of a successful pull and a successful push. So you would be pulling funds from one account and pushing funds to another. And this is always a two-step process when using cards and or bank accounts for both the pull and the push. Technically, there's always a source and a destination, even if the source is an offline cash transaction. So in this example of a classic request to pull funds from a sender's debit card and push to a receiver's debit card, you would include a reference ID, which for TabaPay is chosen by the merchant to identify each transaction uniquely. And then the card, you would add the card and account owner information. Sorry, my computer is freezing a little bit. There we go. And this is the sender data. And then also the destination account ID, which is a processor assigned settlement account ID. And then soft descriptor info, which is a field that a merchant can use to provide customized instructions on what name, say company or individual, should be populated on the cardholder's bank statement, the amount of the transaction, and an optional custom memo field of up to 32 characters. So this is really just used for back office reconciliation purposes. It's an optional field that we can provide. So then in the pull response, there you go. Okay, so in the pull response, you will receive a transaction ID. So this is super important because that transaction ID is a critical component for the corresponding push transaction. So when you make the subsequent push transaction, you're going to need to use that transaction ID to link the pull and the corresponding push. And it all uses the same create transaction API resource. So as a quick side note, let's say you didn't process a pull transaction using the API. Maybe it was sourced with cash or check, for example. Then you would alternatively, you would add the sender name to the push and maybe a watchlist screening value like an OFAC check result if it's an international transaction, and then address and the source of funds. So you can put the transaction ID in there if you've done both, or you can fill out all of the details if it's what looks like a standalone push because the source was not another card. In a TabaPay, we call this the corresponding block. So on the push side, you can see here the corresponding ID, or you would add the corresponding block information. You would also add the settlement account info tied to the source account. And this is set up with TabaPay in this case so that we can track the bank accounts that you need for both the push and the pull. And then receiver, AKA account owner name, soft descriptor, amount, and memo. And notice in this example that we're pulling from a MasterCard and pushing to a Visa account. It doesn't have to be Visa to Visa or MasterCard to MasterCard, and also Discover and Amex are eligible networks as well, along with the regional debit networks. And so behind the scenes, these pull push instructions lead to settlement instructions. So I'm going to move to this page here. So let's say it's day 0. This is the day that you're putting the instructions through the Create Transaction API. And that is indicating that we should, in this example, move $1 from the Visa account that's tied to the sender's Visa card to a MasterCard bank account tied to the receiver's card. And money isn't actually moved on day 0, even though the transactions are processed in real time and promoted as instant to the end users with real-time access to funds mostly. And settlement is still a next day process. And then on day 1, the funds are moved from bank A to bank B. So I'm gonna stop here for another second and see if there are questions in the Zoom chat. And then I'm gonna put in the Zoom chat the Postman credentials you'll need to participate in the next section of the workshop, where you can try out a few scenarios on your own. So we'll take about 5 minutes or so to give everyone a chance to sign in or create an account with Postman if you don't have one. And I'm going to put in the credentials that you're going to need in the chat.
Any questions while you're doing that? So now you'll actually have a chance to get into our sandbox and send fake money or not send real money. Any questions?
And I'm going to turn my camera off for a minute to help with the lag on my computer.
Yes, hold on.
Yeah, just a quick clarification question. You mentioned that the funds would move instantly, but they wouldn't actually settle till the next day. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So settlement is still a next day process, even though the instructions between the two parties are handled within real time. I think quite a few networks and potentially providers still use the cushion of saying within 30 minutes. But realistically speaking, at this point, it's about 97% that will offer of issuers that will offer the funds in real time. So the customer will have real time access to the funds, and it's called a guaranteed fund model, but the actual funds movement still happens a day later. We don't have so the setup isn't like it would be with real time bank account movements where you have a pre-funded account, right? And the settlement happens with those pre-funded funds at the same time that you're sending the instructions. It still has that delay in the background, but it's invisible to the end user. And as far as the end user is concerned, they have instant access to those funds.
Thank you.
Sure. So I've put together, I should have labeled that. So that second long creature is the bearer token that you'll need. And you shouldn't need this client ID because I've already put it in the URL, but I'm going to give that to you as well, just so you have a clear understanding of what each item is. And then this last one, which is also going to be in the snippets that I provide, is the settlement account ID, just so you have it. So you've got the URL that you're going to need, plus the bearer token, the client ID, and the settlement account ID. Okay, so we're going to go back to sharing the screen. All right, and You're going to be here in Postman. So you're going to want to go to Create New. Create an HTTP request. And then you're going to use the feature get. And for authorization, you'll choose bearer token. And you'll enter that bearer token that I provided you with in this field here. And then up here in the URL space, you will enter the URL that I provided in the chat, which includes the demo client ID at the end. And then you should be able to hit send, and you'll get a result, and I'll put this in the chat, that says you're good to go. That should look like this. It may be slightly different for each person. Where did my? Okay. Oh, there's the chat. Okay. So the result should look something like that, saying you're good to go. You can now hit the sandbox. This is everything you had. So we'll make sure everyone has a chance to get set up. And if anyone's having some troubleshooting, if anyone needs some troubleshooting help, we can do that as well. I know I learned the hard way, you want to use Safari if you have a Mac, because you might get a timeout if you try to use Chrome on your MacBook. We have a question here. What does the settlement account ID refer to? Is it the acquirer's merchant account at their bank? So for TabaPay, it's the settlement account ID with us. So we would set those up for you during the onboarding process. You would have a settlement account ID and a destination account ID. So you can say, hey, this is me, and it's tied to my account at that acquiring bank. And I'm a TabaPay customer. And Sarah, please feel free to add more detail if that would help clarify as well. Okay. Any issues with Postman? Everybody good to go? Okay, so I'm going to switch to post. So now you're going to do a post transaction. And we're going to go to body, raw, and then in the text format, you're going to select JSON. And we're going to start with a card query AVS test. So looking back here at the card query, right, we're going to play with this one. So you're going to need the endpoint for your URL. So your URL already has everything, including your client ID, and you just need the new endpoint here in order to process the transaction. Okay, and then I'm going to put the code in here for a quick card query. Example. So you'll post this without the bullet. Let me try that again without the bullet in front of it. That will give you a formatting error, or just make sure to strip it out before you put it in there. There we go. Hit send. And then you should end up with a response that looks similar to this. And so right now, for those that are running through these cases with us, this is hitting TabaPay's sandbox. These are actual test cases that we use for our clients. So hopefully it's helping to clarify some of the details that you would need to think about when using these different use cases. So let's take a look at this response. So we have an SC of 200. So it's a successful transaction and error code 0. It was a pull transaction. It wasn't a pull or a push transaction. It's an AVS check. And you've got a network response code of 5. So this is one of those infamous response codes. The banks use this it's called the do not honor response. And you can see this for a lot of different types of reasons. And for an ABS query, it can be safe to assume that the ABS didn't match. But, you know, just as a sidebar, let's say that I'm going to show you where these are so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So that 5 is a network response code, right? Do not honor. So that's what that means. And it's a good idea to have tables on hand so that you can glean better insights into the causes of a decline. So there are some restrictions on the level of detail that a processor can provide in the response due to PCI constraints. But you would get this network response code, and then you could follow up. Let's say 20% of your transactions are getting an 05 response. You could work with your processor, or if you are the processor, work with your merchants to diagnose the problem and determine if there are changes that you could make to how you're setting up the transaction that may decline or decrease the decline rate. And then on the ABS side, you've got an ABS of U. So if we take a look at the response code of U, it's a generic system unavailable issue. So you may have had a US bank with a non-US ABS attempt, or the ABS in a US bank is not functioning properly. So in this case, there's a decline, and this result text decline comes from the network. It's something that the network controls in terms of the text that they would send back to us. And it just means, sorry, this particular card does not pass the ABS match. Okay. So the next example we're going to run through is using a create transaction pull without an account ID. So what I mean by that is we're going to do a create transaction pull using card data. It's not for a stored account transaction. And so this means that from an API perspective, we need to change our endpoint again. So you're going to add this to the end of your request up at the top. We'll be doing another post transaction. So now we're in the transaction space. And I need to send you the example code without a bullet. Okay. That is being dropped in the chat now. So when you send this in, I might get a reference ID error. So one error to watch out for, since we are using a shared account, is you're going to see, sometimes you'll see a reference ID because it's supposed to be unique each time. So what I do is I just create just add a few little different characters in there, just adjust it a little bit. But really this ID can be anything you want it to be, as long as it's alphanumeric and up to 15 characters. So if you just play with that for a second, then when you send it, you should get a full response. Oops. And I'll send what my response looks like. Yours should be very similar, but you're probably going to have a unique transaction ID for your transaction and a unique approval code, I would assume. And in this case, notice we got an ABS feedback with a code security code of match. So this may look a little bit confusing because it says ABS, but we have ABS and card security code combined in our APIs. So this just means that the card security code that was submitted, as you can see in the request, security code 123 was submitted, is a match. And then you see the details in terms of fees, interchange, network, and TabaPay. But remember, because settlement happens next day, these are estimates. You'll see the final version of the fees the next day. How's everyone doing? We're good. We're good here so far? Okay.
Do we need audience feedback?
So, no, I just want to make sure I'm not rushing through this, or
are there any questions?
Everybody's good?
Okay, go ahead.
We're good? Okay. So the next step is we're going to do a create transaction push. So this will be an example of a basic push transaction, and a few minor details will change. You're going to change your reference ID. I always forget to do that. But you'll want to change that. And the type, as you can see, and what I've put in the example or in the chat, is push instead of pull. And in this case, you're going to be using a destination account ID, using the same settlement account ID as the source account ID. So it's just shifting that credential ID, which I've already put in the example, so you don't have to worry about pulling it from the credentials from one version to the other. And so with this transaction, you're directing TabPay to push funds to a card. And for this test case, to make sure it works correctly in the sandbox, address is also included, but just note that that is an optional field. So I'm going to put it in mine now. Let's see what we get. Sweet. All right, so you should have a result similar to this for your push transaction. And it looks very similar, as you can see, to a pull transaction. But with a push, you know, the classic interchange value is 10 cents for push transactions. And you would see and network fees would be 0. So you would have a pretty good understanding of the push and the pull. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to the example document for a minute, and we're going to talk about deleting transactions. So we'll go through a visual example of what that looks like, and then I will go back to Postman so that you can work on, or you can practice with deleting a transaction. Okay, let's get to the right page here. So when dealing with pull and push transactions, one of the most important universal operating rules in the business is that a pull transaction can be reversed, but a push transaction, once the funds have been sent, cannot. So with push transactions, it's up to the receiving issuer to return the funds. A request would be made through back office, reversal chargeback processes, or support processes, because once those funds are out, they're done. So in this shown scenario, the merchant has processed a successful pull transaction, right? And in the response, they received this transaction ID that they would need to send a corresponding push transaction. So they populated the push transaction, or I'm sorry, the transaction ID into the push transaction, but the push transaction failed. In this example, it failed with a status code of 207, which is a status unknown. An example of this would be like an upstream processing error on a card network level. So the merchant can attempt to push the funds again and again, and maybe they did, but at this point, in this case, they decided to request a delete of the original pull. Okay, so they are pulling or requesting a delete of the pull for 10 cents using that same transaction ID, and then showing a successful record of the delete. So we're going to use the same pull snippet that I provided earlier for create transaction. And then we're going to want to update the card number with a test card. So I'm going to I'm going to go back to Postman, repost that create transaction detail, and then give you the test card that you'll use so that we can trigger a pull followed by a delete. Bear with me 1 second here. We'll run back to Postman. And then I will, okay, create transaction pull. Make sure I give you the right one. And you should already have it in your chat, but where did the chat go? There we go. All right, so this is what we use, but in this case, you're going to use a different card number. So here is the card number, 11. Should be 1, 2, 3. There should be 8 nines. Okay. So go ahead and put that in Postman. I'm going to double check to make sure. I'm just going to post it twice just in case. All the 9s make me a little cross-eyed. All right. Then don't forget to change your reference ID, and please ensure that your amount is set to 25 cents to make sure that it works. Okay. All right, so we're going to run a post transaction. It's a pull transaction. Change my reference ID and send. So for this one, everybody's going to have a different response, or should. So this transaction ID is what you're going to want to keep. So make sure to save your individual transaction ID for the next step. But your response should look something like this. Just pretty much the same thing that we saw before, except now you have a different transaction ID. Okay. So we're going to change our postman format to, or I'm sorry, our method to delete. And then looking back at the TabaPay developer site, you can see transaction, delete. So for this method, we would use the reversal. So what you need to do for your endpoint is add that transaction ID followed by the URL endpoint for a reversal. Do that with mine. Assuming I kept it. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. And drum roll, let's see if that works. Hot dog. All right, so once you enter the information there, and please let us know if you had any issues. So you've got your test card, reference ID, your unique transaction ID. You should receive a result that looks like this. And this lets you know that the delete request was completed successfully. And then if you tried to rerun the delete request, you should get an error message, right, of a reversal, because the system has already said, nope, this has been deleted. Any questions or concerns on that particular setup? Okay, so we're doing great on time. So what I'd like to do is, some of you might be thinking, ugh, this is too easy. So what I want to do is give you about 10 minutes to play with the sandbox. And you can build upon these basic requests by adding other objects from TabaPay's transaction create, right? So if you want to use corresponding block, OFAC, accounts, currency, memo, ACH options, everything should work. Some of the objects you might get a restricted response, but for the most part, you should be good. So we're going to take 10 minutes now for you can practice with the various advanced objects to add to these basic requests through Postman to see what you get from the sandbox. And then we'll be here for any troubleshooting that you need. And then after that, we're going to leave the last 20 minutes or so open to the floor to talk about your use cases as we mentioned before. So how will instant payments
Erin,
impact your business? Yeah.
Let me just interject because we're down to about 10 or 11 people in the room. Do you guys want to work on this for 10 or 15 minutes, or just want to ask questions and wrap up? I want to be conscious of people's time. We've been in the room for a while. You guys want to continue to work, or should we just have some Q&A and wrap up? Show of hands, Q&A and wrap up. Okay. Yeah, I think. Well. Okay. First of all, I guess any questions that you have based on what we've shown so far? Okay. All right.
Oh, well, it does look like there is a question in the chat.
Yep.
What does the AVS response code R mean? Are you expected to retry the AVS check after some time on receiving this response? So let me cheat and see what that code is. System unavailable. Yes, you could check again. Yeah, sometimes these are those dreaded response codes where there could be a card network outage or issue, and then you just have to try again in the future.
All right. Well, great. First, I want to thank everybody for your time and attention. We strove today to give you a real technical deep dive on how to actually build a push payment transaction. It reminds me why I stopped coding and developing many years ago. But again, if you need more information, you can reach out on our website. You can reach out through me. My business cards are here. what we strive to show you today is it's interesting. Most of our clients can integrate in a matter of a couple of weeks. The longer pole in the tent, again, is really getting the underwriting done with the banks, having all the compliance, having all the financial stature, all the things that you need to do as a fintech to do what you do applies equally, if not more so, on the payment side. So, whether you work with TabletPay, Moov, whomever, just take into account to find good processors and good partners that can help you through all of that. Great. Well, again, Erin, Sarah, Jason, thank you, and thank everybody for sticking along, and we appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.